Hello, everybody. Hello. We want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Quiche Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamak, Serrano, Cahuilla, Payam-Cuichum, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, river systems, and waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement, we invite you to visit the USC Van Hunnick History Department website. My colleague Maya will put that into the chat for those of you joining us on Zoom. And for those of you on Zoom, we'd love to know where you're watching from, so feel free to let us know in the chat. And there's a wonderful website and resource for finding out what Indigenous territory you're on, and Maya will be sharing that link as well. My name is Martha Stroud. I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and I'm delighted to welcome those of you in person today and those of you joining us online. I have just a couple of notes about protocols for people on Zoom. Right now, you're viewing a side-by-side, I hope, of the slides that we're sharing and the speaker. And I just wanted to let you know, in case you weren't aware, that you can make either window larger or smaller by dragging the dividing line between the two windows. So if you want to make our speaker bigger on your screen or the slides bigger, that's what to do. We will have time for questions and discussion following the lecture, so we invite questions from those of you in the room, of course, and on Zoom by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we'll try to get to as many questions as time permits. We do share the chat and questions with each speaker, so even if your question isn't asked, they will get a copy of it after the lecture. And if you have other comments to make in the chat, we'll share that with our speaker as well. Also, this is being recorded, and we're going to make the recording widely available, so be aware of that. And we ask you to please be respectful in the chat and the Q&A. So now, to introduce today's lecture and our speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies, and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Gunner.
Thank you, Martha, and as always, thank you, Martha, Maya, and Charlotte for preparing the event of today. First, for those who don't know the center, a few brief words about the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, which was founded in 2014. The center is trying to advance new areas of interdisciplinary research on genocide and mass violence. It promotes research with the unique Holocaust and genocide resources and collections on campus here at the University of Southern California, including the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive and the Holocaust and Genocide Studies collection at the USC libraries. The center manages a rich academic program, including hosting annual international conferences, bestowing numerous fellowships, as this one, and welcoming also visiting scholars. The Center Research Fellowship is one of the first fellowship, or was one of the first fellowships, but it was last bestowed in 2018-2019 to Jean-Marc Dreyfus, and because of structural changes, We couldn't bestow this for several years, so we are happy that our kind of re-inaugural scholar, Perez, Pilar Pérez, is now kind of in a way continuing this important fellowship, which enables a senior scholar from any discipline to spend a semester in residence at our center and make use of the already mentioned rich resources in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies here at USC. To introduce the speaker, Pilar Pérez is a professor of history at the National University of Río Negro in Argentina. She is the professor since 2009. She is also a researcher at Argentina's National Scientific and Technical Research Council since 2015. She earned her PhD in history from the National University in Buenos Aires and has been the director and co-director of several research projects. For example, since 2019, she has directed the project Archives and Narratives of Northern Patagonia, a project obviously about the construction of archives and also community memories. She has been member of several networks of researchers regarding the field of genocide and also indigenous politics in Argentina since 2005. And this network brings together research, activism, and also communication on indigenous issues in Argentina, and works towards the acknowledgement of genocide perpetrated against indigenous people in Argentina and also on the issue of reparations. She is the author and co-author of several dozen articles and more book chapters, and has authored 2 books in 2016, Archivos de Silencio, Estado, Indígenas y Violencia en Patagonia Central, 1878 hasta 1941, which was published with Prometeo Libros and is about the state discrimination and persecution and violence against indigenous people in central Patagonia. And in 2019, she authored Quien mata a Lucas Muñoz, Versiones sobre la vida, desaparición y muerte de un policía rionegrino, which was published by Deseo. And practically the title is Who Killed Lucas Muñoz? Versions about his life, his disappearance, and the murder by a policeman, right, in Rio Negro. She also has co-edited 2 books. Last year, she co-edited El Papel del Archivo, Políticas y Historias de la Documentación Pública y Privada in North Patagonia, which is about the role of archives and politics and histories of public documentation in northern Patagonia. And in 2019, she co-edited La Tierra de los Otros, la dimensión territorial del genocidio indígena en Río Negro, together with several other co-editors, which is about the territorial dimension of the mass violence and the genocide against indigenous people in Rio Negro. And this is kind of, in a way, a good segue into the topic of today, which doesn't focus on Argentina, but more on Guatemala. Just wanted to mention that she has obviously presented her research results at various international conferences. And I think that's sometimes really important to mention as a different dimension. She's not just a scholar, but she's also a radio host. She is a filmmaker in a way, producer, and also an actress. So I think that's also important to know that there are different facets of our guest today. And yeah, I want to hand over to Pilar Pérez and give her a warm hand.
Well, thank you so much for the time being here. I'm very grateful for having spent this semester at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research at USC. And I want to thank especially to Martha, to Wolf, but also to my daily partners like Charlotte or Maya, Michelle, and many others whom I have shared with throughout this month. So thank you so much. I'll read the title. It's Indigenous Territory and Displacement in the Guatemalan Genocide Survivor Testimonies. And what I want to share with you is, we know after the truth commissions that work in Guatemala, after the peace agreements in 1996, that there was a shift during the Lucas Garcia and Ríos Montt governments of what was called the internal armed conflict. And so this turn was a genocidal turn, and it was specially directed against indigenous territories. And so we know this because of the figures, because of the numbers. 80 or more than 80% of the victims were from Mayan population, and more than 600 villages have been destroyed by the scorched earth campaigns. So, and one more figure that is very important is that 1.5 million persons were displaced from where they used to be, over a population of 7 million people, more or less. So, taking this, all this work that had been done during the 90s and that scholars kept producing, what I want to focus on is how the territory was lived through this experience. And there is I come from the studies of indigenous genocide in Argentina, so I can I kind of compare what happened in one case and the other. And there is a problem there that sometimes we tend to think that indigenous genocide is a long-standing thing that has been going on for more than 500 years. And so I think this is a problem, and this is a mistake, and it should be analyzed through a historical lens, recovering the historicity behind each different case. So what we do find is that there are some repeated stereotypes. And one of those things is that indigenous people are regularly placed outside the conformation of the nation state, outside the history of the nation state, and are considered to be against economic development. And and their ways of living and their tradition and its culture are thought to be, well, something like part of the past of those nation states, but not part of the present. And so we find this all over the Americas, but then the question is, how can we interpret every different case? Because we cannot say, because the category of genocide will lose strength if we say this has always been a genocide. What is the difference here? So I think, and this is the hypothesis that I'm working with the testimonies I work with, that the scorched earth campaigns were not only a means to kill people, to kill indigenous people, but also a way of implementing a new way of experiencing and exploiting and thinking about the territory. So it's a technology of government that is spread since what people call la violencia onwards. And so in order to think about this hypothesis, I work with the VHA, which has more than 600 testimonies on the Guatemalan survivors. I didn't work with all of them, of course. I worked with 40. But I want to share that what I did was I watched the whole interviews, and after a little struggle with what I wanted to ask and was not asked during the interviews, what I came down is, well, I will follow the logic that the document is sharing. That is, people share what happened in their lives before, during, and after the genocide. So this is what I did. And the interviews were carried out by the FAFG, which I assume many of you know is the anthropological forensics team that is still working today in Guatemala, about more or less 10 years ago. So I chose 3 regions. Yes, no? That. Yeah. I chose 3 regions to share with you, not to compare them, but to show how in the testimonies of the different regions, some things were more portrayed or important for the people in the interview. So the regions are the Ixil region, the village of Río Negro, which has nothing to do with the place I come from, but it's the same name. And the third one is the Ixcan. So the Ixil region would be this sort of triangle that you can see right around here. The Ixcan would be up north. It's all the highlands in Guatemala. And the Río Negro would be somewhere between here where the Achi communities are. So, why did I choose these 3? Well, the Ixil region, it's a traditional, long-standing settlement of indigenous territory. So by the time of the internal armed conflict and by the mid-70s, it was specified by the army as a red zone, that is a zone that was in or under control of the guerrilla, allegedly. And the Río Negro region, I chose it because it is also a long-standing settlement. I mean, people can go back 4 or 5 generations of their own families that were living in that region, but it still shows some aspects that are different from the Ixil region. Both of them were places that were not very well connected to the rest of the country through roads or through any other ways. I mean, they were kind of mysterious places where people live, but nobody did exactly know in what ways they live. I mean, people, the rest of the Guatemala. And the Ixcan region, I chose it because it is a far more recent settlement. It was populated by the mid-70s approximately, and so the dynamics there were quite different for the people, I mean, in their testimonies. So I'll start by the Ixil region. There. This is a picture taken from the VHA and the testimony of Pedro Pacheco. And so here, as in many other places through the Scorched Earth campaigns, what we hear from the people is the systematic way in which the army came in through these villages. And so what they generally say is that first they came and took some people away that were disappeared or that were killed. Then after that they came for the men, and they took the men away. And after that they came a third time and killed women, children, elders, etc., and burned down all the village all along. And so, and those who survived these attacks, most of the time escaped to the mountains. So here we can see him, Pedro Pacheco, showing the place in the mountain, the place where he was hiding when he watched the massacres taking place as he was a child. And so I want to stop and pay attention to one particular space that was created within the villages that was before the violence, what people call the milpa, that is the crops that people had. They used these crops to eat. I mean, they were the source of food. But it is not only that. I mean, when people speak about the milpa, what they are telling is that this is a place where you learn to work, where you teach your children or your grandchildren how to work and what are the values of the territory and what to expect of what you do as a person and as a family and as a community. And also, the milpa shows when a person comes of age, I mean, grows up, and it's autonomous enough to grow its own milpa and gather his own family, generally men. And it's also a place where ceremonies take place and where culture is trespassed from one generation to the other. So I want to stop there a little bit and say, when the milpa is burned down in in the massacres, it's not only the food source that they are destroying, but the whole way in which people organize their lives, including, for example, the times. I mean, the milpa organized the times in the life of people, if they were there to plant, if they were there to harvest, if they were there, or they could travel, or they could, I mean, all their life were organized through this milpa, and not only familiar life, but also communal life. The other place I like to stop and think about a little bit is the mountains, where people escape to. We know, because of all the Truth Commission works and because of what survivors said, that the mountains were the place where they could hide and survive. But before la violencia, before the scorched earth campaigns, people didn't go to the mountains freely because these were places where they feared to be. I mean, these were places where wild animals would live, where the milpa wouldn't grow, where many dangers and problems came for people that went into the mountains. But here they have no other choice than to escape to the mountains. So the sense of the idea of the mountain changed when the scorched earth campaigns started. So some of the people that escaped to the mountains lived in the mountains for years, a decade. This came to be known as the CPRs, the communities of population in resistance would be the translation, and people who had escaped there organized a whole new way of living in which they would plant, for example, the milpa, but they would do it in a strategically way, for example, in different spots, so that when the army came in, they wouldn't destroy everything that they were producing, or they, for example, they couldn't cook during the day. They had norms. They couldn't cook during the daytime because the smoke could be seen, and so this would could bring upon bombardments or other kinds of violence. And so they had to adjust a whole new way of living within the mountains. That is the expression going under the mountains. You can see there how they organized new sorts of villages and how they have places where to hide within the mountains if a bombardment, for example, came. And so, it's a whole very interesting political strategy that came out of these people escaping. But for those who couldn't stand living in the mountains, because living in the mountains meant a very hard way of living. I mean, they also say, for example, they mentioned that they would feel as if they had been turned into animals for living in the mountains. And because they had no clothes, they had no food, they had the basic things, soap to wash or anything. So many of them were, when the government issued an amnesty in 1982 for them to come back down from the mountains, they did. They presented themselves in the regiments or in what was called, when they came down to what was called the model villages. So here you can see a model village. I will show you some more pictures now. I wanted to show that map that was produced by the forensic architecture team, that is a team from Mexico, that is working. This is the Ixil region, and they have worked a couple of years ago showing how right after the villages were destroyed, a new model village was created beside it, or over it, or on top of it. So the light blue ones are the model villages that were created in the Ixil region. What were these model villages? Here you can see, I mean, I think the pictures are really telling of how they completely changed the idea of how the people should live. And so the model villages were guarded by what was called the PAC, of the civil patrols, the self-defense civil patrols. So these were people from the village that were turned into the guards of the village, and they were, of course, monitored by the army, but they had to exercise this idea of self-defense. And so people would live in these houses, and they didn't have place where to grow their milpa. They didn't have, well, you saw the contrast between them, what they were doing in the mountains and the picture here. This is another model village. Of course, they would have to enter the ritual idea of the citizenship that the army had, that was getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning, singing the anthem, paying respect to the flag of Guatemala, and many different ceremonial things that happen each and every day. And so this became, in a way, naturalized by the people who lived in these model villages. I will read to you a quote from one of the interviewees, Ambrosio, that he says he was made to work as a civil patrol, and he said, "They made us work without payment. They said, I need the patrollers to go open those roads. We did hard work, which had no sense and no benefit, but they did it just to fool us, para chingarnos," for those who know the expression. And so this was the everyday life of the people living in these model villages. And so another place that changed the way it used to be understood is the finca, which is the ranches. That is, the finca was a place where certain workers lived, and they lived in exchange of their work, and they would be, they were understood as places of exploitation, of working exploitation. But when the massacres came to the villages, these fincas were, the army was settled within the fincas, okay? And so the people who presented there knew that they were going under the power of the army, but still they felt that inside the fincas they wouldn't be massacred. So they felt like, in a way, safe within places that before were considered places of exploitation. Okay, so this is also something that started to change in the perception of the territory. And one more thing is, why did people come back? What did they say when they came back to this? When they came down from the mountains and went to live in the, for example, I spoke about the massacre of Chell. So a survivor from the massacre of Chell said, I went back. So this is what he said. I came back because this is my place. I grew up here. When I came back, the houses were too close. The land was reduced. There were no plantations, no coffee plantations, no banana plantations. Now everything is closed. It's really hard to live here now. But I cannot forget what I saw in the massacre because I grew up with those people. The second region I want to address is the Achi communities nearby the village of Río Negro, which is a place that where people say that even though the massacres took place in 1982, people mention that la violencia started long before, by the mid-70s, when the government officials, the INTA and the INDE, which are the government agencies for agricultural development, came down to the region and told them, well, there is a project of constructing a dam. And so the effects that this will have in the villages is that they will flood everything, and of course, you will have to leave, but we will offer you land somewhere else. Some people distrusted this. I mean, they couldn't really, they were not telling them where, when, and how they would be relocated. And so meetings within the communities started growing more and more intense. Because some of the people of the communities say, well, but if a dam, a whole project like this comes, we will be able to work. We will have work and paid work. And so when the struggle within the communities was taking place, la violencia started, as people say, by the disappearance and killings of those who opposed the project of the dam. So, The Río Negro massacre is quite well known in the Guatemalan experience because there is a lot of work done by the survivors in order to narrate and to tell their own view of history. And this is something I want to stress. So you see that, for example, they have the Historical and Educational Center that, for example, has created all sorts of images remembering what had happened to the victims, had built monuments, they have the center, and they have their own narrative of what had happened. So many of the testimonies show that they are they have a very tidy way of telling the story. The first massacre happened this, the second this, the third this, so you can follow what happened to the people. And so when as I said, the tactic of the army was always the same. I mean, they were systematic in this. They took at first some people who were significant for the community. After that, they came for the men. After that, they came from the women, children, elders, and everybody else, and the village itself. And so, but besides that, we know now that that was a systematic way. They didn't at the moment. And for example, I will share with you a quote from Fabian and what his mother told him at the moment that the men had been already killed a few days before, and so they knew that the army was coming to the village. But still, his mother told him, don't run away. We are just peasants and we are not doing anything wrong. So people did not feel that they were targeted yet at this moment. And many of them thought the same thing because they were evangelical. They were not related to Catholic priests, for example, that were associated with the communists and leftists and whatever. And they thought that nothing would happen to them. But the scorched earth is the idea of killing them all, burning everything, and leaving no trace behind. So one of the significant massacres that happened here was that the women and children were taken to a place up mountain where there was a witness, that is again, this is all material taken from the Historical and Educational Center. I cannot pronounce that. I don't know if anybody does. But that's the Indigenous name, the Achi name that the center has. The women were taken up here, and there was a witness there who was a child, and who saw how the women were raped and killed. More than 100 women and children were killed here. So, and this is the ceremony that they did many years after to show and to pay respect to the people there. But what I want to share with this is that there were places of death, I mean, marked clandestine cemeteries, they call it, spread all over the territory. And so people feared these places because they say they could hear the mourning of the dead. And this is something that is repeated. So they knew that a massacre had taken place here. This, for example, that there was not anything else built upon this, but where the model villages were settled, they were most of the time settled over these clandestine cemeteries. Or the clandestine cemeteries were held within the fincas, for example. And so this created a whole different landscape of places of death. And for example, in the testimony of a woman that escaped through the mountain, Carmen, she said that when she escaped, she was naked and she was wandering for she doesn't know how much time, wandering lost in the mountains and going from one place to the other, where sometimes she would be rejected and sometimes she would be helped in order to carry on with her life. And so this woman was trapped after a while and taken to a model village that was the model village of Pacush. And in her testimony, there is a very important thing about these model villages, that is what was to be within a model village and what were the dangers of going out of these model villages. Because we may think, well, they were, well, as the government said, they were developing poles that were trying to re-educate and to bring down the people who had escaped or were communists and needed to be re-educated. And so she said that when she moved to Pacush, she couldn't, the people, and she and more than 35 families of Rio Negro ended up in that place. And she said that the neighbors there distrusted her. There was secrecy and rumors and a lot of things going on behind her back. So she wouldn't get a job, for example. She couldn't live there. She couldn't work there because nobody would want her in her house. But the danger of going out for men was that they could be killed or tortured or imprisoned in very terrible conditions. But for women in particular, the danger was that they would be raped. So they knew that if they needed to go out of the villa, and they did need it because they had to work or they had to go to the hospital or whatever, but the danger was you knew what you were playing with. These were the inside and the outside of the model village. So going back to the little boy that witnessed the massacre in Pacachon, which is Jesus. I know it's a very well testimony in the VHA, but still it's very telling. This is one of the monuments that is in Rio Negro. He said that more or less 8 years after the massacre, he went back to that area and said that he walked there and he could see, I read his quote, "I could see a skull. I picked it up. It wasn't a stone, it was a skull. I wasn't afraid anymore. I remembered. After a while that he was holding the skull, my hands started aching. I thought too many things, and my hands hurt. When I came down, the pain was gone. So that's when I thought that these people could not remain there, that they were people and that they were important." So this is the place where the first exhumations and the process of taking the dead to rest in proper cemeteries started to take place. And that's why I focus on this place, because there are lots of ways in which people remember monuments, ceremonies, educational centers, etc., and they have their own way of telling what happened there. Still, the place does not exist as such, because the dam was built anyway and was finished in 1983, so most of the people could not return to that place anymore. And even though there is a testimony of Sebastián, he says that he got a fishing permit to fish in the lake, and that this is what they used to do when they were children. I mean, they would fish in the river and play in the river and practice all sorts of ceremonies in the river that's gone because of the dam. And they would get a fishing permit, and this was their way in back to the area of Rio Negro. And they stood there. I mean, he brought his family, his brother, etc., and they are living there. But for example, Carmen she didn't ever went back. Okay. And finally, I'd like to talk about the Ixcan region. I will do it through the narrative that this painted blanket created by Dolores has. That is to show people that were in the area for a long time, in the Ixcan area, but who had been internal displaced for a long time before La Violencia started. So these people would be workers that used to work during the summers, for example, in the sugar, cotton, coffee plantations. And the work was terrible in these kind of plantations, but they used to go back to a place until they didn't have any more land or enough land to have a family. So these people started going up north and looking for places to live and to settle. And they came to an area, this is what many testimonies retell, where which took them really hard work to make it grow, to grow crops and to grow milpa, but finally they did it. And when they finally did it, the army came down. This is by the mid-70s, okay, this is before the period of La Violencia explicitly, and so the lands that they were occupying is what is called the Northern Transversal Strip. It is the red points that you see there, which is a road that was being created at the moment that communicated the east and the west of the country. You can see it's right by the border of Mexico, and that the lands that were beside the road that was created was being privatized under the hands of Lucas Garcia, principally, and many other officers in the army. So they were gently threatened to go away from those lands, and they were suggested to go to the Ixcan. But they couldn't go back to their homes in order to pick up anything. They had to go right that moment. So, and this was mid-70s, okay? So they went up north, and they started to build a new life in the Ixcan region. And so the place there was very hard to make it productive because there were no roads. If they needed something, they had to travel like 2 or 3 days to the closest market in order to buy something. So and their land in itself was not as good as the land they had worked before. So they had to use fertilizers. And there were many needs that this place had. So what they came up with was the organization of cooperatives. And these were also pushed by the church, because it was a suggestion at the moment. Back in Argentina, we also had the movement of cooperatives that were created and pushed also forward by the church. And they started building important cooperatives that helped them organize collectively, but also to sell their goods, and also to bring and create a market in the area where they would exchange their goods. This, for example, is taken from the testimony of Julio Arnulfo, that is the names of the disappeared of La Cooperativa La Montañita, okay? So these cooperatives, I want to emphasize one thing, they created a market in the place. And I emphasize this because it's not only the place where you go and buy and sell something, which is good enough, but it's also the place where people meet, where people gather, where people shared artistic things, cultural things, where the life happens, okay? So the market was a very important achievement for them. And when La Violencia started in this area, again, the first thing that they did was kidnapping or murdering the leaders of the cooperatives. This is the first thing that happened. Then another thing that happened is that they started infiltrating the common areas, the social areas, such as the market, with what people call orejas, ears. I mean, people who were paid by the government who would listen what was going on and would tell those above them what was happening. And if these orejas heard or named you, that meant you would end up in prison or disappeared. So and they saw they could live through the way in which the places they had built were turning into this dark thing in which all these other things were going on. They also kidnapped and disappeared or imprisoned men who were tortured, and they were made to hear how they kill others. But under the threat that if they would say something to the widows that were at the same time organizing to know what happened to their husbands, they would end up the same way. So again, this making the people who were the victims part of the process of being silent, of not sharing what was going on, was a very important part, and this before the massacres took place. So following Dolores Blanquet, she draws or paints the massacre of '82, when one of the villages was burned down. You can see there, this is a quote from the Operación Sofía, which is one of the government documents that we have now to study what had happened. And so I will read the quote from the Operación Sofía from the government. After, they say, this is an official talking, after we had burned down their houses and destroyed their settlements, the guerrilla and their collaborators, they must be spoken to and made understand why they suffered this abuse. Okay? The idea is that the violence is imprinted in order to teach something. Okay? They will have to understand why this happened to them. So you can see there the maps that the army had in order to follow and to see which were the villages that were going to be destroyed in that operation. You can see here the market under guard in 1986. So the market that was this special area where people share things and whatever was under the military guard. And many of the people who escaped and this is the case of Dolores as well, who escaped through the mountains, they also crossed the border and from between Guatemala and Mexico and became refugees in Mexico. And this was a whole, you can see that the stories of these people are always moving. I mean, it's very significant how they are all the time displaced from one point to the other. So they were in Mexico like more or less 10 years. They were there under the figure of refugees. They were given lands to work, but they felt that they were discriminated and that they were not part of that place, and they wanted to return to Guatemala, or the feeling of returning started to grow within the different refugees that were in Mexico. And this is the refugees immediately after they got to Mexico. And so they organized and made an international plea that was backed up by the UN and returned to Guatemala in 1995 approximately. But when they came back to Guatemala, there is an interviewee, Santos, that says something very significant, that is, we left Mexico without celebration because they were leaving the house they had for 10 years. And they came in Guatemala without a celebration because when they got there, their houses were already taken by people who had got there under the model village regime. So, and one more thing is that when they escaped to the mountains, not to get killed during the massacres, the government issued a decree that said that if the houses were not populated, they were abandoned. So they had lost everything. And so when they went back, they went back geographically to a place, but their place was no longer there. And besides that, they had these neighbors that had been there for 10 years, okay? And so they wouldn't renounce to everything they had so far. So I will read you a final quote by Santos, this person that I was referring to. He said, "We returned because there is a right. We have a right," that's what he's saying. "Those who are on the center of San Pablo," that is one of the villages, "don't want to leave. But and I wanted to pay attention to this. They argue that we are guerrilla. So the army is no longer there. The peace agreements have already been signed, but the discourse that the insurgency, counterinsurgency has been imposed to the people, and it's now part of how people relate to each other in everyday life." So, this is also a quote from Diego Morales, which I want you to look at this. He decided to be in the interview with his corn there, because this is very telling for him. And he says, I read the English, but it's in Spanish for those who read Spanish. "When you decide to have a family, you have to build a house. I couldn't leave anything because they burnt everything down. They left me with this scar, that scar. It's sad that la violencia came. If it wouldn't, we'll have a house, but they left us in the poverty. Okay? So, well, what I would finally like to say is that, again, I'm not trying to show how, there were economic interests behind all this deterritorialization. Of course, we can see the construction of a dam, we can see the privatization of land, the urbanization, and the discipline of workers for the market, for the capitalist market. But at the same time, I wanted to show that this process of deterritorializing that took place in many different ways, through the death camps or clandestine cemeteries, through burning the villages down or destroying the milpa, through, of course, through killing people and many other violent ways. But they reinscribed in a new way that changed absolutely what was the life before for these people. I mean, the territory is completely changed, but also the relationship with them, between them, and also the way in which they live and can live and could live in the territory. So, am I good with the time?
Thank you so much for such a rich description. You said they didn't ask questions about what you were interested in, and yet you have pulled so much out of the testimonies. Mm-hmm. So now we're going to open it for Q&A, and just a reminder for people on Zoom to ask in the Q&A box at the bottom. And for those of you in the room, if you could just keep your voices up when you ask the questions so that the people on Zoom can hear you. You mind calling people? Yeah.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. This was really interesting. I had a question about the testimonies themselves and the way that because I'm used to watching testimonies where they stay in one place, and then the examples you're showing either by holding the drawn map or by actually going outside and showing the path. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about how that's also a displacing of our notions of the testimonies in a way.
I don't know if I grasped the whole question, but the testimonies, which they are an interview most of the time. But by the end, the people can share whatever it is that they want to share. Mm-hmm. So in some of the videos of the interviews, you have footage that was taken outside, and they are really interesting because people can show the places themselves, and when they are there, they enact in a different way. I mean, they have to tell where were you, the distance, what happened, what you smelled, and this changed a lot the immediate interview when they say, for example, what had happened during a massacre. So they are really telling, and that's why I chose to incorporate that.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you talk a bit more about those clandestine cemeteries and how is that different from a mass grave?
Okay.
Is it?
I don't really know if there's a technical difference, but this is the way that people call them, clandestine cemeteries. Because I think that the idea of clandestine is that when the massacres took place, they did different things with the bodies. I mean, some of them, for example, were thrown to the river, and some others were put into mass graves, some others were burned down. But the thing of the clandestine cemetery is that people knew the spot, the landscape here, the jungle, or the mountains, they grow over everything in a couple of years. It's like nothing had happened there. But still people knew that what had happened in the different places. And besides, sometimes they use these places on purpose. Let's build a school over a place where a mass grave has taken place, so nobody would destroy the school.
You mean the government used that to cover it up? Yeah. Okay.
So, and then they are very important today because this is the work that the FAFG is doing. They are uncovering all these clandestine cemeteries, but of course they have to have they have to go hand in hand with people because they are the ones that know where the bodies are. So this is a very interesting thing to follow, and also because some of these places had been marked as places of memory, and some others are still there, and they kind of keep on mourning what had happened. So this is what people refer to.
Thank you so much. Can you tell us a little bit more? Did the interviews about the kind of villages in resistance in the mountains when they came back and then they encountered these model villages, did they later stay after everything was, let's say, more or less done with the peace accord and everything? Did they stay in these model villages since they were close to their former villages? Or did they move out of these model villages and then recreated their own villages? Can you tell us something about
it? There is a variety of answers to that because of what the testimonies that I watched. Some people didn't want to go back to the places they had lived in because they wouldn't do it, or because they had had a very hard work at living at the places, at the model villages that they were put into, and so they stayed there. Many others had no rights to go back to the land, so they kind of, they lost it and that's it. And some others organized. There are many different organizations within Guatemala that struggle for land, and sometimes the land that they're given is not exactly the same, but it's in a nearby place. And so, for example, some fincas were taken by the government and distributed among the people who survived the massacres. And so they are living nearby, but not exactly in the same place. And in some testimonies, people say they had to go back because that's what the place where they grew or their parents were there, so they had to go back. But it's not a homogeneous answer.
Hi, I have a question from our Zoom audience from Adriana Reynoso, who is an indexer and training supervisor at the Shoah Foundation. Adriana says, "Thank you for your presentation, Pilar. I especially appreciate your incorporation of the testimonies and survivors' reflections. In these reflections, there's a kind of tension between a physical and emotional sense of place or space. Will your work incorporate this tension into the understanding of the long-lasting impacts of the genocide in Guatemala?"
Yes, absolutely. I think that this is, that's what I'm trying to show through these ways that La Violencia affects the people in their present. The present 10 years ago, that is the one I'm working with the testimonies. And of course, I think that this has, that moment in time, structured the whole society that came after this. So I think it is very important to pay attention to the emotional part, but also to the material. That this is what we were discussing. Sometimes people could go back to a place, but for example, in the testimony of Diego that I showed, he said, that was my moment when I could create something for my family. That was gone. Now I cannot do that anymore. That was my moment and I lost it. So of course, there is always this lasting effect that violence had over the lives of people. Martha?
I was very struck by your descriptions of the multiple roles that markets played or crops played in the social life that's destroyed when a place is destroyed. But I think the thing that struck me the most was when you were talking about the people who went into the mountains and how they described that they felt like animals living there. And it made me think of a sort of new layer of destruction that state-directed genocide can cause, where it damages one's perception of themselves. And in a way, if they're sort of losing their humanity in their own self-perception, is that contributing to achieving the state's goal of destroying them?
I think so. You are making me remember of a very well-known phrase here in the United States that was brought up by a general, I think, in the late 19th century, that was kill the Indian, leave the man. I mean, this idea of these people being so dehumanized that to go back to being human, they have to be a completely different thing. I mean, they had to build up in a completely different way. So yes, I think this was one of the aims, and particularly when the people tell the first days or the first period that they were in the mountains, there is many words related to losing everything. I mean, losing your life, your material things, your own perception of yourself, losing family, losing. So this is like very present. Mm-hmm. And the idea of turning into an animal is like turning something that you are part of that mountain that you're now in. So yeah.
Yeah, and the way it's tied to the place that they're in. Mm-hmm. It's really insightful. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. So you touched on a little bit of the differences between violence against men and women. So of those 40 testimonies, I was wondering what the split was between men and women's testimonies. And then in that, I was wondering if you had noted any like gendered relations to the space and territory that came up.
Yes, I'm not especially focusing on that. But it is very evident the differences between women and men. I mean, the gender thing is present there because of it was a systematic thing, the raping of women. I mean, they knew they were under this threat all along, never mind their ages. I mean, that was not an issue. And they also, it was a way to, they used this threat over women in order to control them too. I mean, then this is something particular to women. I don't know if there was sexual violence, for example, against men, because this is not a regular question asked or talked about. So I wouldn't say there wasn't, because maybe there was. And this is something that is beneath everything. But also, the women relate to that rape and that violence, even though they may have a political discourse saying, well, this happened in our country because of this and that, and we suffer because we are indigenous. When they have to talk about their gender position, they sometimes, and many times in their testimonies, it's the first time that they talk about it. So it's like they don't know if they, in 10 years ago, they are well enough to talk about that because their family don't know, their husbands don't know. And so this is a kind of another way of violence against women that at least men don't share that. I mean, they can talk about many different things that they saw and even happened to them, even the rape of their own women or mother or whatever. They can talk about it more freely, let's say, than what women can. And also the testimonies of women are less processed. I mean, they don't know exactly where they are going. And many times with men, this can be, I don't know, because they had the experience of sharing what had happened to them. And this does not seem to be the case with women. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. We have two questions from the Zoom, if that's all right. Both are interested in how you use the testimony. The first question from Carla McCall, who's a professor in the Gender and Women's Studies Department at Pomona College, says, thank you so much for your presentation. My dissertation is also about centering the embodied testimonies of Guatemalan women survivors of the genocides. And you mentioned you used the VHA to gather the testimonies. There are 600 testimonies. And so how as a researcher did you select the testimony for your research or analysis?
Okay, yes. there are 600 testimonies, and so exactly I had to make a choice. Not all of them are indexed, so my choice was through following people from the same village. I mean, like gathering 4, 5, 6 testimonies related to one village, and so I could grasp the general idea of how that village was created, how did people get along with each other, what they felt of the place they lived before, how they came to live in there. And so this is what I chose, like a regional, territorial point of choosing the testimonies. Yeah, so that's why I chose a whole region. Then we have 3 villages, and but it still are the highlands in Guatemala. I haven't heard, for example, testimonies, or 1 or 2 maybe, but from the city of Guatemala, which I know the dynamics were completely different. So I wanted to look at these areas in particular.
And the second question that has to do with like working with the testimonies is from Michaela Ullman, who's an exile studies librarian at USC's Special Collections, who says, "Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned at the beginning, I think, that there were questions that you wished were asked in the testimony recordings. As someone who also works on this topic, would you mind sharing what some of those questions or like the information you wish were asked or presented in the testimonies?"
Yes. As soon as, for example, when I talked about the milpa and the importance the milpa had for people, which came out in every testimony, I would have loved to ask many more things about that. Like, for example, what type of things they learned, who taught them. Some of them, for example, told that they were especially taught to work at the milpa by their grandparents because they had a special relationship or kinship relation. So there are many more things that we can say about working, for example, at the milpa, and I would have loved to know, but then the testimonies are too focused on the crimes, which I understand and it's okay, but they are not exactly what I was after. So, for example, that's an example of what I was looking for.
Pilar, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a lot of questions, but something that stood out to me throughout your presentation was the connection that memory and displacement are having, especially also today in Guatemala with still being debates also with if the genocide still happened or didn't happen. But I was wondering specifically about the experiences of children, and especially how is it that the various groups that went to the mountains and also the modern villages and also those who went to Mexico and came back, how is it that these children reflect on this violencia that happened through the displacement, or how is that they're connecting with it, especially when some of them were really young and were in the modern villages and were maybe being forcibly assimilated into the Guatemalans. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, the testimonies I heard that they were children at the moment, they have like different things. For example, Jesus, which is, he could go back to the place where he had lost all his family and give a completely different sense to what he had lived through. It's like a little bit like an exception there, because there are other stories of children that say, for example, I lost my language. I spoke Shil, and now I was brought up by priests or nuns in different places, and I lived there till I was 18, and I didn't know anything about my past until somebody from the family came looking for him, or he realized. One interesting thing that I couldn't ask, for example, is the dressings. People from the different regions dressed in different ways. So, for example, the testimony, I don't remember his name, but what he said is, I was like 18 years old, and once I saw a woman dressed in the way I remember the people in my village used to dress. And so this scene made him go back to a lot of different things, but when he was a grown-up. I would have loved to hear, for example, stories of the kids that were born in the mountains or displaced, but I didn't. So because most of them were witness of what had happened. So this is like a different point to start your story, your life story. Well, yes, this is. This has marked them, but as they were children, they could at the same time be like free in a way of most of the responsibilities that this system imposed, this power system imposed over people, because they were not made into PACs, they were not forced to work. Sometimes they were appropriated by the perpetrators, so they had this experience too, but they can ask questions and make a completely different narrative of themselves. That's what I felt, at least with the ones that were children at the moment.
Any more questions?
Yes. Well, there is a big discussion about the genocide, the use of the term genocide, and when genocide finished. And some category emerged from the testimonies is la violencia, and any category. Do you think that perhaps this term can answer better the question about when this process finished and the consequences?
Yes, I didn't especially talk about that, but when people refer to la violencia, it's a very interesting thing that they are not pointing to the same date in time. They are referring to something that happened maybe in 1975, and there is an event that happened that is what starts la violencia. And this, when does it end? It's a significant question depending on, for example, the region that we are talking about. So the people that went back, for example, from Dishkan, that were displaced and they were refugees and they came back as returnees, and they were categories, that we put over people. And so they are still struggling to be living in the villages that they used to live, but they have to deal with a completely different social order. So la violencia there is like, it stretches over time. So it's not that clear that it ends in a certain moment in time. So that's why I say these events are the ones that structure the lives of these people and that condition the way they relate to the rest of their neighbors and their villages. So maybe if we think about genocide as a juridical term, and the UN Convention for the crime, well, the crimes could maybe be spotted in a certain moment in time, but la violencia expresses something more bigger, let's say.
Any other questions? Well, please join me in thanking Pilar. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming in person and online. Our next event is next Wednesday. We're marking the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. And if you can come to USC, we hope you will join us. Thank you again.